The story of Vietnam doesn't begin with war, bombs, or headlines. It begins with wet soil stuck between toes, the smell of rice paddies under a burning sun, and a people who learned very early that survival meant adapting fast or disappearing forever. Because long before Vietnam was a country, it was a corridor, a passageway, a prize, a land everyone wanted to pass through, rule, or exploit. And that single fact shaped everything that followed, from its myths to its rebellions, from its emperors to its farmers. Because geography is destiny, and Vietnam's geography was both a gift and a curse, stretched like a thin spine along the South China Sea, mountains guarding one side, water opening the other, forcing its people to look outward while constantly defending inward. And the earliest humans arrived here tens of thousands of years ago, hunter-gatherers leaving behind stone tools and fire pits, slowly learning that this land flooded, dried, flooded again, and only those who mastered water could master life. Which is why rice didn't just become food, it became culture, ritual, time itself, planting and harvesting defining calendars, festivals, family structures, and even spiritual beliefs. And from these early river-dwelling communities rose legends like Lac Long Quan and Ao Ko, Dragon Lord and Fairy Mother, symbols of sea and mountain, already hinting at a divided yet united identity. Because Vietnam always saw itself as born from two worlds at once. And by the first millennium BCE, the Dong Son culture emerged, leaving behind massive bronze drums decorated with warriors, boats, birds, and rituals. Proof that this was not some isolated backwater, but a complex society trading, organizing, fighting, and celebrating life. Yet even then, shadows loomed from the north, because China was rising, expanding, absorbing, and when the Han Empire finally marched south in 111 BCE, Vietnam's long nightmare and long training began at the same time. Nearly 1,000 years of Chinese domination followed. And this is where most countries would have been erased, language replaced, identity dissolved, history rewritten. But Vietnam didn't vanish. It learned. It absorbed Chinese administration, Confucian bureaucracy, writing systems, farming techniques, while quietly refusing to surrender its soul, keeping village autonomy, local customs, matriarchal traces, and resistance simmering under the surface. And that resistance finally exploded in 40 CE with the Trung Sisters, two women who raised an army, rode elephants into battle, and briefly reclaimed independence, not as a footnote, but as a foundational myth. Because Vietnam learned early that rebellion wasn't an exception, it was tradition. Even when the revolt failed, the message didn't. This land would never accept permanent rule. And generation after generation rose, failed, adapted, rose again. Until, in 938 CE, No Quen used tides and sharpened stakes at the Battle of Bac Dong to annihilate a Chinese fleet, proving that intelligence and terrain could defeat empire. And with that victory, Vietnam re-emerged as an independent state, not naive, not fragile, but hardened by centuries of occupation. And what followed wasn't peace, it was consolidation, kingship, bureaucracy, expansion southward in a slow, grinding push known as Nam Tien, where Vietnamese settlers displaced or absorbed Champa kingdoms, spreading rice culture, language, and control, often brutally. Because Vietnam was now becoming what it once fought against, a regional power imposing itself on others. And this duality runs through its entire history, victim and conqueror, defender and aggressor, moral clarity blurred by survival. And internally, the dynasties rose and fell, Li, Tran, Lê, each tested by Mongol invasions, internal rebellions, court intrigue, and economic strain. Yet time and again, Vietnam repelled foreign threats, especially the Mongols, whose armies crushed much of Eurasia but failed here, stopped by guerrilla tactics, scorched earth strategies, and a population willing to disappear into forests rather than surrender. And this wasn't romantic bravery, it was calculated endurance, the understanding that time could be weaponized, that empires tire faster than peasants defending their land. But while external threats forged unity, internal divisions slowly cracked it.
powerful families, regional warlords, corrupt mandarins, and by the 17th century the country was effectively split between the Tring lords in the north and Nguyen lords in the south, two Vietnams locked in Cold War, draining resources, militarizing society, and exhausting the people. And into that exhaustion walked outsiders again, this time not marching with armies, but arriving on ships, missionaries, traders, and eventually colonizers, because Europe had discovered that Asia wasn't just distant, it was profitable, and Vietnam's fragmentation made it vulnerable. Catholic missionaries introduced new beliefs and a Romanized script that would later become modern Vietnamese writing, while French traders and officials began mapping, studying, planning, waiting. And by the time the Nguyen dynasty reunified Vietnam in the early 19th century under Gia Long, it was already too late, because the world had changed. Cannons were stronger, empires more aggressive, and isolation was no longer protection, it was weakness. And the Nguyen court clung to Confucian tradition, resisting reform, persecuting Christians, misunderstanding the threat, until French gunboats forced their way in. Treaties were signed under duress, territory was ceded piece by piece, and by the late 1800s, Vietnam was fully absorbed into French Indochina, reduced from sovereign kingdom to colonial asset, its rice exported, its labor exploited, its culture demeaned. And yet, even under colonial rule, the same old pattern returned: adaptation, resistance, patience. Because colonial schools inadvertently created a new educated class, exposed to ideas of nationalism, socialism, self-determination, and among the peasants and workers, anger fermented quietly, waiting for the right moment to erupt. And that moment was coming, but not yet, because before Vietnam could fight modern wars, it had to finish becoming modern itself, fractured, colonized, humiliated, but very much alive.
French rule didn't just change Vietnam's borders, it invaded daily life, turning land into plantations, peasants into cheap labor, and tradition into something backward that needed civilizing. And this humiliation cut deeper than hunger, because the French didn't merely take resources, they took dignity, installing a racial hierarchy where Europeans ruled, collaborators benefited, and the vast majority survived under taxes, forced labor, and laws written in a foreign tongue. Yet resistance didn't explode immediately, because Vietnam had learned something dangerous over centuries. Rushing blindly gets you crushed. So instead, resistance diversified. Some chose reform, hoping education and modernization could win autonomy. Others chose revolt, secret societies, peasant uprisings, assassinations. But all failed because the colonial system was too strong, too well-armed, until a new idea arrived that reframed struggle entirely: Marxism. Not as abstract theory, but as a practical weapon against imperialism. And no one embodied this shift more completely than a man who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung, a poor scholar's son who left Vietnam not as a revolutionary, but as a dishwasher, a sailor, a laborer, absorbing the world from its lowest levels, watching colonial hypocrisy firsthand in France, Britain, the United States, realizing that freedom preached by empires never applied to people like him. And when he encountered communism, he saw not ideology, but leverage, a language powerful enough to shame the West and mobilize the masses. And by the 1920s and 30s, Vietnamese nationalism and communism fused into something uniquely local, disciplined, patient, underground, organizing peasants, workers, students, slowly building a network that survived arrests, executions, betrayals, because again, Vietnam understood endurance. Then World War II shattered the colonial order. Japan invaded Indochina. The French collapsed, and suddenly power was fractured, confused, contested. And in that chaos, the Viet Minh emerged, not as dreamers, but as organizers, providing food, protection, literacy, presenting themselves as the only force that actually cared about Vietnamese survival. And when Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh seized the moment, declaring independence in Hanoi, quoting the American Declaration of Independence itself, a calculated move meant to expose Western hypocrisy. But the world didn't listen, because colonialism wasn't finished, it was just rebranding, and France returned, determined to reclaim Indochina, triggering the First Indochina War, a brutal mismatch on paper, tanks and planes versus farmers with rifles. But paper doesn't fight wars, people do. And Vietnam turned its terrain, villages, and time into weapons again, dragging France into a conflict it couldn't morally justify or decisively win, culminating in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where French forces were surrounded, starved, bombarded, and finally defeated. A shockwave that rippled through every colonial empire on Earth, proving that a determined anti-colonial movement could defeat a modern European army. But victory came with a price, because at Geneva, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, supposedly temporarily, North and South, communism versus anti-communism. Ideology slicing a nation already scarred by centuries of division. And here is where global politics swallowed Vietnam whole, because this was no longer just a Vietnamese struggle, it became a chessboard for the Cold War. The North backed by the Soviet Union and China, the South propped up by the United States, not because Americans understood Vietnam, but because they feared losing credibility, feared the domino theory, feared appearing weak. And fear is a terrible strategist, because instead of supporting genuine self-determination, the U.S. backed corrupt, unpopular regimes in the South, alienating peasants, suppressing dissent, repeating the same colonial mistakes under a different flag, while the North framed the war not as communism versus capitalism, but as national liberation versus foreign control, a narrative deeply embedded in Vietnamese memory. And as tensions escalated, elections promised at Geneva were quietly abandoned because everyone knew the communists would win. And that decision sealed the path to war, a war that would consume Vietnam's land, people, and psyche. But not yet at full scale, because at first it was shadowy. Insurgents in the South, political assassinations, village intimidation, propaganda battles, slowly escalating while Washington debated and delayed, misunderstanding the enemy completely, assuming firepower could substitute legitimacy, assuming body counts equaled progress, assuming Vietnam was a battlefield rather than a nation with a 1,000-year memory of resistance. And when American troops finally arrived in large numbers in the mid-1960s, they walked into a war they could fight tactically, but not strategically. Because Vietnam wasn't trying to win quickly, it was trying to outlast, to exhaust, to erode political will, using guerrilla warfare, tunnels, booby traps, blending fighters with civilians, forcing impossible moral choices on soldiers, while American bombing campaigns devastated forests, villages, and civilians without breaking the enemy's resolve. And every bomb that missed a target hit credibility instead, turning global opinion against the war, fueling protests, fractures at home. While in Vietnam, the cost was unimaginable. Millions killed, landscapes poisoned, generations traumatized. Yet even then, the North kept pushing, not because it was painless, but because it believed suffering now prevented subjugation forever. And this belief, whether you agree with it or not, explains why Vietnam didn't collapse under pressure, why, despite superior American technology, the war drifted toward a stalemate, then withdrawal, then collapse of the South. Because when the U.S. finally left, exhausted and divided, the question wasn't if Saigon would fall, but when. And in 1975, it did, ending the war militarily, but not ending Vietnam's struggle.
When the war ended and Saigon fell, the world saw images of helicopters lifting off rooftops and called it peace. But for Vietnam,
peace arrived heavy, suspicious, and incomplete, because victory does not automatically heal a country that has been torn apart for decades, and reunification in 1975 didn't feel like reunion for millions. It felt like replacement, as the communist government moved quickly to consolidate control, dismantling South Vietnam's institutions, sending former officials, soldiers, intellectuals to re-education camps that were less about education and more about breaking old loyalties, while hundreds of thousands fled by sea, risking pirates, storms, death, becoming the boat people, scattering Vietnamese identity across the globe. And inside the country, the economy collapsed under the weight of war damage, central planning, isolation, and inexperience. Fields were mined, factories outdated, cities overcrowded, and ideology couldn't feed families. So ration cards replaced markets, scarcity became normal, and the same peasants who had endured war now faced hunger and peace. Yet the leadership framed suffering as temporary, necessary, the final price of independence. But time kept passing and conditions didn't improve because Vietnam had won a war but inherited a broken system, and geopolitics turned cruel again. China, once an ally, invaded Vietnam in 1979 to teach it a lesson, exposing how fragile alliances really were, while Cambodia's Khmer Rouge crisis dragged Vietnam into another costly conflict, draining resources further, isolating the country diplomatically, sanctioned by the West, distrusted by neighbors. Vietnam stood alone, proud but poor. And by the mid-1980s, reality could no longer be ignored. Ideology was failing at the most basic task, survival. And this is where Vietnam made one of its most important decisions. Not loud, not dramatic, but transformative. Doi Moi, renovation, opening the economy, allowing private enterprise, foreign investment, market mechanisms, while keeping political control centralized. A pragmatic compromise that admitted something revolutionary by communist standards. Purity doesn't matter if people are starving. And slowly, painfully, it worked. Rice production surged. Vietnam became a major exporter. Cities woke up, motorcycles filled streets, markets returned. A new generation grew up without daily hunger. And for the first time in centuries, Vietnam experienced something close to stability. Not perfect, not free in the Western sense, but functional. And this is where Vietnam's modern identity began to take shape. Neither socialist utopia nor capitalist democracy, but something distinctly Vietnamese, blending state control with ruthless practicality, memory with ambition, and the scars of war never disappeared. They simply changed form. Unexploded bombs still killed farmers. Agent Orange still deformed children. Trauma passed silently between generations, rarely spoken but deeply felt. Because in Vietnamese culture, endurance is valued more than expression, survival more than confession. And as the economy grew, so did inequality, corruption, and tension between old revolutionary ideals and new material desires. Yet compared to the past, this tension felt manageable, almost luxurious. And internationally, Vietnam repositioned itself carefully, normalizing relations with the United States in the 1990s, joining global trade networks, turning former enemies into investors, a move that would have seemed impossible during the war, but again shows Vietnam's defining trait, adaptability over pride. And by the 21st century, Vietnam was no longer defined only by war. It became a manufacturing hub, a young workforce, a rising economy, while still governed by a single party that tolerated no political opposition, creating a paradox: economic openness without political freedom, stability without voice, and the population largely accepted it, not because they were ignorant, but because history taught them chaos is worse than control. And this acceptance isn't passive, it's calculated, a social contract shaped by centuries of survival, where people trade expression for predictability, growth for silence. But this contract is under strain because younger Vietnamese, connected to the world, educated, ambitious, question limits quietly, pushing boundaries online, in business, in culture, while the state responds with cautious tolerance mixed with repression. And the future sits in that tension between memory of suffering and desire
desire for more, between fear of instability and hunger for dignity. And this is the unfinished story of Vietnam, a country that refuses simple labels, communist yet capitalist, victim yet victor, scarred yet rising, always shaped by its past but never trapped by it. And to understand Vietnam today, you must stop asking who won the war and start asking what survival actually costs over centuries.
To really understand Vietnam, you have to strip away the romantic war movies and propaganda slogans and look at how power actually functions day to day. Because survival didn't end with independence, it just changed shape. And the modern Vietnamese state is built on one core fear learned the hard way. Instability kills faster than oppression, a lesson burned into memory by centuries of invasions, civil wars, famines, and foreign interference. So, the Communist Party positions itself not as a perfect ruler, but as a necessary shield, the final wall between order and chaos. And many people, especially older generations, believe this deeply, not because they love ideology, but because they remember what happens when authority collapses. Yet this logic creates its own problems, because when power is centralized and unquestioned, corruption doesn't appear as an exception, it becomes a system. Officials extract favors, land seizures displace farmers, money talks louder than law, and people learn to navigate power quietly rather than confront it openly, building networks, relationships, informal solutions, because direct resistance feels risky and historically unrewarding. And this quiet navigation is not weakness, it's adaptation. The same adaptation that let Vietnam survive Chinese rule, French colonization, American bombing, now repurposed for bureaucratic capitalism. But under the surface, pressure builds, because economic growth raises expectations faster than political systems evolve. Young people born after the war don't carry the same trauma. They didn't hide in tunnels or starve under ration cards. They grew up with smartphones, global music, foreign travel dreams, and they measure their lives against the world, not against past suffering. And this generational shift matters more than any ideology, because legitimacy based on war memory decays with time, and the state knows this, which is why nationalism is constantly reinforced through education, media, controlled narratives of history that emphasize unity, sacrifice, external threats, especially tensions with China over the South China Sea, because nothing consolidates internal control like an external rival. And China is the perfect antagonist, historically dominant, culturally influential, economically intertwined, politically dangerous. And Vietnam's relationship with China is a masterclass in strategic paranoia. Cooperate economically, resist politically, prepare militarily, never trust fully, never break completely. And this balancing act defines Vietnam's foreign policy today, extending also to the United States, Japan, India, Russia, hedging, diversifying, never betting survival on a single partner again, because history punished that mistake too many times. And internally, culture becomes another battlefield. Art, film, music push limits subtly. Criticism wrapped in metaphor, humor, nostalgia, because overt confrontation invites suppression while ambiguity survives. And Vietnamese society becomes layered, official narratives on the surface, lived reality underneath. And this duality seeps into personal identity. People say one thing publicly and another privately, not out of dishonesty, but out of learned caution. And this psychological split is one of the deepest scars left by decades of surveillance and ideological enforcement. Yet it also produces resilience, creativity, dark humor, and ability to live fully within constraints. And if you zoom out, you see a country still doing what it has always done, absorbing pressure and reshaping itself around it, not exploding, not surrendering, just bending enough to stay intact. But the question that looms is whether this strategy can hold forever, because climate change threatens the Mekong Delta, rising seas threaten rice production, urbanization strains infrastructure, inequality sharpens social divides, and digital connectivity weakens information control, challenges that cannot be managed by silence alone. And Vietnam stands at another historical hinge point,
quieter than war, slower than revolution, but potentially just as decisive, where the choices made now will shape whether survival remains enough or whether the next chapter demands something more than endurance.
Vietnam's story has never been about victory in the way outsiders understand it. It has always been about continuation, about making sure the line doesn't break, the people don't disappear, the land doesn't lose its voice. And this is why judging Vietnam through simple lenses like communism versus capitalism or war lost versus war won completely misses the point. Because Vietnam measures success in generations, not elections or headlines. And when you look at it that way, the country's choices start making uncomfortable sense. The silence, the control, the pragmatism, the constant calculation of risk. Because every era taught the same lesson in different language: survive first, debate later. And this mentality runs through families, education, work culture, even relationships, where stability is valued over expression, consistency over confrontation. And this doesn't mean people lack ambition or emotion. It means they channel it differently, into business, into migration, into private dreams rather than public demands. And this explains why Vietnam can appear calm on the surface while constantly moving underneath, a nation of motion without noise. But this survival logic also carries a cost that becomes clearer as memories of war fade. Because fear-based unity loses power when younger generations no longer feel the fear personally. And when stability becomes the norm rather than the reward, people start asking for meaning, dignity, voice, not loudly yet, but persistently. And this is the quiet tension shaping Vietnam's future, not tanks or bombs, but expectations. And the state faces a choice it has never faced before, not how to defeat an enemy, but how to evolve without collapsing. Because history trained it to resist change imposed from outside, not to manage change rising from within. And whether it can do that will define the next century. Because Vietnam cannot endlessly rely on memory of suffering to justify limits on freedom, just as it cannot afford the chaos that uncontrolled reform might bring. And this balance is fragile, but Vietnam has survived fragile moments before, again and again, through empires, colonizers, wars, famines, betrayals, and isolation, always emerging altered but intact. And that is the real through line of its history, not ideology, not nationalism, but adaptation under pressure. And this is why Vietnam refuses to be a tragedy or a triumph. It is a process, unfinished, unresolved, still negotiating between past scars and future possibilities. And if there is one brutal truth its history teaches, it's this: survival buys you time, but eventually time demands answers. And Vietnam is approaching that moment quietly, patiently, the same way it always has, without spectacle, without permission, and without disappearing.